Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
Beginning this week, we are adding a new feature. At the end of our episode, we want to honor people that have written in and either asked questions or provided good insight or confirmation. So this week, for our inaugural segment, we are reading from a handwritten letter from Riley, who is 14, from Pittsburgh, and just really encouraged to share that with you. So make sure you stay through the end so you can experience that with us.
This is part 3 in our series on death, and Jason is going to start us off with our passage today.
Yeah, so we will be reading from John 16, beginning in verse 19 through 22. Jesus saw that they, speaking of the apostles, wanted to ask him about this. So he said to them, "Are you asking one another what I meant when I said, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy."
The thing that amazes me about this passage is if you go to this chapter in the book of John, it is just like a few hours basically before Jesus is going to be handed over. And it is just surrounded by teachings and application and just preparation that Jesus has here. And what I love about this passage is it's kind of this little bit of break where Jesus stops for a moment to give some pastoral care to his disciples. The reality of the situation for the disciples is they still at this point are not expecting Jesus to die. They're still have some sort of expectation for what they thought the Messiah was going to do. And so they were still not expecting Jesus to die. And so Jesus knew when he was handed over, when he was killed, that there would be utter despair and utter heartbreak for the disciples. But Jesus also knew that the resurrection was coming. Jesus also knew that sorrow, that pain would be wiped away. And there's almost a sense like it's just a couple days. Yeah, those couple days are really terrible and they suck and they're miserable and they're full of fear for the disciples. But it's amazing to me that it's so important to Jesus for just these next few hours for the disciples that Jesus gives them hope. That is just the emphasis that Jesus puts on hope and how important it is to him and how important it is to give the people he loves hope. Man, it's just amazing to me.
What amazes me about this, and like you said, this is in a bigger section. Jesus washes the apostles' feet at 13 in chapter 13, and then he all through these passages 14 through 17, those chapters, he's giving them a lot of information that they did not know, and this is part of the information they did not know. Though if you're a Bible reader, if you've read the Gospels, you're like, how could you not know? Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably what amazes me about this passage is where the apostles are still.
Yeah.
It just amazes me, I guess specifically, that Jesus keeps on with the mission when the apostles are clearly not getting the mission. That is just, I don't consider myself like this just fantastic leader of people and can really hone in people.
I consider myself that.
But. Well, that's why I'm asking you. Maybe you can relate with Jesus here, but I just don't consider myself that way. I feel like my leadership is just, okay, guys, what do you think about this? And then I nurture it, then I watch for God, then I try again. And whereas I've seen some leaders just say, here's the vision, here's the point, here's where this is going. And they're just able to really work with people to almost make it seem like it's their idea. And if you ask the people, what's our goal? And, everybody says, this is it. And this is the opposite of what Jesus is experiencing with these apostles. They don't get hardly any of the main points. Mm-hmm. They just get, we're here and we trust Jesus. And that's the part that amazes me is that Jesus is tolerating, not just tolerating, but he is still entrusting them with a biggest deal ever, ever, ever. And they don't even get the basic premise of the journey.
And not even like biggest deal ever in terms of like hyperbole, like literally the biggest deal ever.
Right.
What I love about what you said is it's kind of a reversal of how traditionally I've thought about it, and I think how most people think about it, because the perplexing part, right, is why do the disciples think this way? But I like how you reframe it into, it's amazing how Jesus flips it around in a sort of way. That naturally leads to the next question. What perplexes you about this passage, Jason?
Yeah, exactly what you're saying. You know, as amazing as Jesus is, that's how perplexing it is to look at these men. And these men are not, I mean, they're at least average intelligence. They're very brave. I mean, they took a lot of risk in following him, and it's not getting better. Matter of fact, I think, per what you were saying earlier, they're still holding out for he's not going to die. There's going to be this kingdom. They're going to be on his right and left hand. They'll have power and they'll have resources and they'll drive out Rome and whatever that's going to look like. And so that I've heard people, there may even be a book called The Adventures of Missing the Point. And I'm like, they are in this constant, almost intentional misunderstanding around Jesus. He will say X and they will say, you said Y, right? And he's like, I said X. And they're like, Y. And you're like, all right. And he just keeps moving. But yeah, it's how do you sit in the presence of the Son of God, watching what he does? He's made at least 4 significant times of description. Now, early on, he's a little bit, elusive and like, okay, is he talking about himself or somebody else? But he's getting to the point. And here in these passages, he's like, it's me. I'm talking about me. Me. I'm going to die. I'm going to do this. And in Matthew, which is a corollary time, Peter's like, no, you won't. And you're like, all right. Well, how are you missing this?
The crazy thing about it, so from some of my reading, when Jesus says in a little while, many people believe that that's hearkening back to very specific imagery in the book of Isaiah that like specifically connotates the giving, like child being born and of the resurrection of the dead. And what you said there is really interesting to me because I don't think I've ever said this about the disciples, but I felt it a lot when you said that it's almost willfully ignorant. It's almost like they're intentionally not getting the point. It's something that I felt for a long time, and something like, well, I'm not going to say that because I put myself in that position. But when you just said that, I kind of began to think back at things that maybe sometimes Jesus has hit me over the head with, or the Holy Spirit has maybe bludgeoned me with kindly to get across a point to me. And I look back at the messages that I received and the messages that it was combating in my own heart. And I think sometimes there is a willful ignorance. There is a willfully ignoring what God is trying to tell me in that moment. And for me, what you just said there, it almost humanizes the disciples even more, because anytime we're reading a text 2,000 years old, as beautiful as a writer as anybody could be, it's still hard to think of them as sometimes actual people that existed.
Absolutely. I totally agree with all of that. So for you, how would you articulate what perplexes you?
Yeah, so what perplexes me, and this is especially as a follower of Jesus, right? Jesus has been preparing his disciples, like you said, over and over and over again. This is going to happen. I'm going to die. And then the Son of Man will be raised in 3. He says it multiple different ways. But basically, the gist of the whole thing is I am going to die. And it's something that Jesus has reiterated over and over and over again to his disciples. And I think about our life, right? I think about, our walk in the church and in Christianity in general. Like, we know we're going to die. We know it's going to happen. It's just a fact of life. And yet, even though we know the fact, even though we can ponder it forever and ever, when it comes and it hits us in the face, or even when we know what's going to happen and it creeps up on us, or we walk towards it because we know it's going to happen, it still seems wrong. And what I love about this passage, even though it's so perplexing, like, what is it about the human spirit that when we know death is coming or we don't know death is coming, whatever the context of a death occurs, it is always wrong for us. I think you mentioned this in an earlier podcast. Like, we always feel like it can't be the right way. We always feel like it can't be the answer. And man, just I have some thoughts on it, but why that is something that has been placed inside of our hearts, and it's something that we can identify with the disciples 2,000 years ago. Man, that's just really perplexing for me.
I totally appreciate that. I live there. I mean, that first point you made about intentionally, willfully ignoring what God wants, man, maybe we need to do an episode on it. Here's every time I do that in a day.
I think that'd be more of an episode, more than one episode.
We'll do a 12-year series on it. I just think I look back at a day and I'm like, man, like I know better. And it could be small things. And I take great comfort in the fact that most of my stuff doesn't directly hurt people. It's usually in my own head or
you want to hear, I'll go and I'll just make this kind of real. This happened last week. I was getting, I work in the mornings at UPS, and I was getting off work, and I had somewhere I had to be. I had an appointment that I had to be at, and a guy, his car wouldn't start, and he asked me, he was like, hey, can you help me out with this? But because I was awkward and saying I had an appointment and I didn't want to get into it, I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I just can't. And I left that. I left the parking lot, and I was driving down the road, and I was starting to feel that guilt kind of creep in. And I was like, no, I had the appointment. And then I realized, wait a second, I could just push the appointment back. Like I could have called and pushed the appointment back, and it would have been no problem whatsoever. And I began to realize, oh, that was a completely 100% selfish act because I didn't want to sacrifice 5 to 10 minutes of my life. And the Holy Spirit really convicted me of it. And I felt bad because I work at UPS. It's a massive place, and I couldn't find this person to confess to and say I'm so sorry to. And I came home to Hannah, and it almost wrecked my day. And I love the contrast from like when I look back on a day, and they're just these little things, right? Like I didn't tell the full truth, or I was rude in a way that was not necessary. And I contrast that with days where I feel really, man, I feel like I'm following the will of God, and I feel like I'm doing really well, and I'm seeking after the face of Jesus. And how much better I feel in those days. Like when I lay my head down after a day like that, and I feel like that was the way things were supposed to be, that I was living in harmony and in concert with life. And then on a day where I wasn't doing that, where I was rejecting or willfully ignoring what God wanted for me, the restlessness that I feel in my spirit over everything I did that day.
Okay, now you just jumped on my soapbox, so I don't want to stay here long, but I want to point out, in those 2 days that you described, those 2 different types of days, the issue wasn't you accomplished something on one day more than another. The issue was, were you intentionally tuning into Jesus or not? And that's at the key. And it does tie into the overall conversation with how do we deal with death? How do we process grieving as believers in Christ? And then even how do we help people that don't believe in God process death and grieving? But that idea of our goal is not accomplishment. Our goal is trust. Our goal is listening.
Yeah.
So on either of those days, matter of fact, the day that you lay down and you're like, man, I was intentionally disobeying God or not listening or pushing Him out in some way, you might have gone to church that day, done communion just right, sang just right, served just right. But if you weren't tuning into Christ, that doesn't draw you nearer to Christ. Our accomplishments don't draw us nearer to God.
Yeah.
Our dependence on Him draws us near, our trust in Him. And I think that's really key to this.
Absolutely.
To this discussion.
Absolutely. So redirecting a little bit now, Jesus will talk about to His disciples, hey, you're going to have this is going to be really hard for you, right? I'm going to die, and you're going to be in agony. You're going to have sorrow out the wazoo. But then I'm going to come back, and you'll have joy abundantly. And what's really fascinating about this, especially for our purposes today, is what are some things that we can draw on this in terms of how we react to death, how we talk to people who are grieving death. So yeah, what are some takeaways that you have, Jason?
Well, for me, every time we talk about grieving death, I go to my daughter Jessica. In my mind and heart, it's like just natural. I don't have to think about it. It's just there. So her 24th birthday was on the 30th of 2020, of June 30th. So she'd be 24, but she only lived 2 months. And so she never left the hospital. She shouldn't have made it. Like, we got the feel like, hey, she was born and she survived. She was born at like 24 weeks. And for those that aren't tuned in, that's usually 40 weeks. So we were way ahead of schedule there. And she made it through the delivery, the C-section. She made it through the first few days. And with each passing day, we were told, hey, be hopeful. And people were coming alongside us and saying, I knew a kid that was born at this weight at this time, and now they're playing basketball, and we're hearing all these hopeful stories. And the medical people were gold. This was done in Lubbock, Texas. Shout out to UMC or whatever they call it now, if anybody's listening, that area. But they were gold. And I mean, we became real family. We spent an enormous amount of time in the NICU and NICU unit. And so, but I felt like everything was going great. I mean, relative to where she was. And they said at 4 weeks, they said she's going to have a surgery because she has a double colon, which I didn't know that was possible. And they are going to have to cut her, which the incision was only going to be about 5 inches, but her whole body's circumference was about 5 inches. So there was no way she should have made it through that surgery. And she did. And I thought, man, that is so weird. That's got to mean she's going to live. And then about 2 weeks later, she started just going downhill, and she was being kept alive by life support, but it was it became pretty clear. And then God put us through the ringer a bit. The doctors came to us, and it was a very special meeting, and they said, look, we don't think she's ever getting better. She's starting to swell up. It's just a lot of bad things. And if you've ever had a person in the hospital that is life or death, you get really good at knowing what oxygen saturations are. And I'm not a medical person, but I knew what was going on there. And so it was just very tough. So we asked for 24 more hours, and they would have taken her off life support that minute or waited another month, And so basically when it went 24 hours, nothing had changed, nothing at all. We asked God, will you show us something? But we had made a commitment of 24 hours, and we felt like him not showing us anything good or anything bad meant just give it to him. You know what I mean? There was no real signal that we can interpret. And we'd heard about children that were taken off, or people in general taken off life support, I guess babies taken off life support, and they actually did breathe on their own. And so for the first time we held our baby, and they took off, we held her, and they took her off life support, and it's like in a movie, it just flatlined. Mm-hmm. So we are just weeping. And so just the following days and weeks, we were... Yeah, and Heather would be the first to say that it took such a beating on her faith. I had a different view of God than she did. She viewed that if you serve God and you love God, then this wouldn't happen. I viewed that God really didn't give a care much about you at all. And by some luck, you might get saved. So if you don't expect God to really help you that much, then you're not too upset when... So I was grieving her, and like the next day especially, I couldn't hardly stop crying. While we're having to do all this prep for the funeral. But it was just very awful. I mean, it was just the worst, days of my life. And then Heather really disconnected. She was like, I don't know if I can't believe in a God that would do this. And I was doing some ministry at the time, and she came to me and she said, can you do ministry with an atheist wife? And I didn't know what else to do. So I said, sure. And then Heather went through a process, and God was gracious, just like he is with the apostles here, and rebuilds that faith. So that's 24 years ago. So initially, I would say, if you'd ask me about it, and of course you're really touchy, we would meet with people that would say, hey, next time you get pregnant, you should do this. You should eat this food, or you should do that. And, oh, if you would get on this special diet, then that wouldn't happen. Like blaming.
And plus, yeah, it's your fault.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's a lot of hurtful things that were said. There's a lot of gold. The funeral was gold. I mean, it was just a beautiful, horrific experience, And then there were a lot of good people. It bound me to some people that I wouldn't have been bound to otherwise. So the way that Heather and I kind of talk about it is the first 5 to 7 years, we were like, man, if you would give us a magic wand, we'd have her back here in an instant. But then probably at 10 or 15 years, we just started to notice that things that happened in our life that we couldn't figure out a way they would have happened had she not died. I want to be really clear. If you've lost a child, this is not your story. Your story is your story. I'm just telling my story. But one of the things is sitting here at 24 years, I realized a while, number one, bringing our Jessica back is not good news for her. Why would I bring her back into this world of heartache? She as a child didn't have the ability to exert her free will, so she's saved. She didn't get to choose God or not choose God, so she's saved. Bringing her back here to be torture, she's not going to be like, oh, I'm so glad I get to fall and get my heart broken and realize that the global matrix of life is so hard sometimes and it feels so unjust. And then for us, it's just the realization that we would be very different people had she lived. Now, a person could hear this as, we're glad she died, and that's the absolute opposite. But it's just what it forced me to keep thinking about. If I'm going to walk with God, I've got to kind of get my head around this a little bit, and the realization of, I wasn't made for this. I wasn't. The sin that entered the world, God's ready for it. He's got a plan. But the injustice I feel, and I say this at almost every funeral I officiate, I wasn't. The reason you feel this is unjust is because it is unjust. You were created for something different, and had Adam and Eve not chosen it, I would have chosen it, because I would have intentionally. We go back to that point, important. But it's the idea, and then recognizing what we talked about a little bit is we're living life. We've said this, I think, in previous podcasts. We're living life right now, but because this is what we created for, we're not living life right now. I mean, there's a whole nother part of this. And I think it's just so very important to recognize that this is the best parts. Because I would imagine the best day with Jessica, and just think how good that would be with this 24-year-old daughter and assessing by my other children, she'd be funny and sharp, and she'd speak her mind and it hurt my feelings, and then we'd apologize and we'd be closer. It'd just be beautiful because I love my relationship with my kids. But then I think, so you take the best moment of that best moment. Is that even beginning to compare to what she's experiencing as a total reality right now? No. Because you know what? In every best moment that I'm experiencing in this life, it's also tied with pain. At the very least, you're like, well, when does this end? And so when, for me, I have to come to that point in myself to say, hey, I realize this is my short life. This is life, but it's not life. Yeah. And then I'm moving to my long life. Now, it's another step then to say, how do you help believers with that process? But I think the first thing is, are you as an individual choosing not to agree with what I've said, but to be on the journey with Christ to lead you to his view? Because his view in this text is, do you not get it, apostles? That not just my death, but your death is the birth. Your death is the birth. That's the joy. The pain is the birth. Yes. It's not that Jesus was resurrected and came back and lived, for a certain amount of time on earth before he left. It was that he was going to cross over, from the pain.
What I think is interesting, and thank you for sharing that story, Jason. You have to imagine the anxiety that the disciples and Jesus have at this moment is off the charts. The things that they're going through, it just... like, they knew they had to come to a breaking point, right? They knew that Jesus can't keep saying all these things, and this tension, just can't keep, it has to break at some point. What I think is so interesting, I think if you had told the disciples, well, things are just going to keep getting awkward and worse, and you're going to have to keep navigating the Pharisees, and you're going to have, that would have been hell on earth for them. And what I think you said is so important, that Jesus compares what is about to happen to the pains of childbirth. And the misery, and I'm watching my wife go through the process of carrying a baby, and it sucks. I could not do it. It looks really miserable. But knowing that one day when we see our child, and not just when we see our child when she or he is born, 5 to 6 months from now, but when we truly see our child in its risen form, when we see them, we won't, these things won't even come into our mind, or if they do come into our mind, there's a whole new light on them.
Right.
And so we talked about application, right? Because I imagine, similar to, if you go to your wife who's in childbirth, and I've already had people warn me about this, and you try to make jokes and you try to make light of it, and you try to be your silly normal self, things aren't going to go well for you as a husband. And similar for you, you said there was a lot of hurt and a lot of heartache for when people came alongside of you, and they, even if they're trying to be helpful and trying to do their best, they said things that were insensitive and were hurtful for the moment. And so, because this is such a massive issue, because it's literal life and death, the thing that we're trying to get at after this podcast is how would you go back and minister to yourself if you could go back 24 years?
That is an outstanding question. Okay, so a lot of times we'll point to Jesus and say, well, I can say this to people because Jesus said that to people. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we've made a point of a million times is Jesus is very laser focused on how he responds to every person. That's why he responds to almost every person differently. He doesn't even do resurrections the same. Why didn't he wait for Jairus' daughter to be put in a tomb and have her march out and, in a mummy wrap, a few days later? Everything is different, with Jesus. And so for me to say, well, Jesus said that, but you have to understand, for whatever Jesus says, if you're going to say what Jesus says, then you have to apply it with the same wisdom Jesus had. And so you can't just say, well, Jesus said this, so I can say this. Well, you got to look into the context and say, what did Jesus know about this person that you may not know about the person in front of you? So we will look through the Bible and see Jesus doing some corrective actions, to the people. But we also have to take into, so let's do an extreme. Peter says, you will not die. This is not going to happen to you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Mm-hmm. So then I say, well, Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. So anytime somebody's saying that something that I don't think is truth, I can say, get behind me, Satan. Well, you have to be able to say, get behind me, Satan, not just with those words, but with the same wisdom that Jesus had. And the truth is, we usually don't have
and with
it.
the same love.
And with the same love and the same, yes, exactly.
You see this all the time in Christian culture of when somebody's being a jerk and they use Jesus like turning the tables to justify it. That's just one of my biggest personal pet peeves. Right,
exactly. And so with this grieving, so a lot of times people will say, okay, so let's be proactive. Let me not just cap on every bad thing I think, because I think a lot of them. But so the first thing you have to acknowledge is your greatest gift to anyone is to love them. And your greatest way to love them is love them in a way that they can hear, that they can feel, that they can experience. Now, most of the time you'll think, how would I know that? And that's a good question to ask, because only God knows that. So you go in with your goal, and by go in, I mean in your encounters with people that are grieving, and it's not just death, any kind of grieving is true, but you go in and you be prepared to listen for God, and oftentimes he'll have it come through the person. So for me to come into you, or me to come to me 24 years ago and say, hey, Jason, I'm really sorry, okay? That is a pretty universal, depending on the nature of the relationship. I don't want to tell you, let me say this, when you're grieving, I don't want that to be the first time I tell you I love you. Yeah. You know what I mean? So honor the nature of the relationship that's there, and God will guide you in that, and let them tell you. If they say, thank you, really appreciate you coming by, that's, you've done what you need to do. You know what I mean? If you want to offer, hey, if anything comes up, but we just need to understand, a grieving person, they're not thinking in a concrete way typically. And very few grieving people have a laundry list of things you can do for them. So it's not a bad thing to offer, because that's communicating your heart. But that's just important to remember, is they're not at capacity most of the time. Now, one thing I will definitely say, it is not a time to convince somebody of how good God is. It is not a time to convince somebody that their person is in a better place. If they don't already believe that, it's insulting. If they do already believe it, it sounds condescending. Mm-hmm. I think the best thing is just you go in, you say, I want to do the most loving thing here, God. I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do? And that's the general. Now, per your relationship with them, so I've heard of people really blessed. We had some people come in and bring us a lot of food that we didn't ask for, but because we had relationship, that worked.
Yeah.
But if a stranger would have shown up and brought us a lot of food, we'd been like, okay. And especially if they have a lot of questions. And see, that's the challenge too, is you're there to absorb their pain. They're not there to solve your curiosity. Well, what's it like to do this? If God wants you to have that, he'll give it to you months early. But the dynamic is being where they are. Jesus is where these apostles are. He was responding to their exact question. Now, I don't know that they understood any of his answers.
So if I were to wrap up what you just said, when you encounter somebody who's grieving, whether it's a death, a sickness, whatever pain it may be, your job as a Jesus follower, your responsibility as a Jesus follower, is to take, if this is your relationship, to take on the emotional weight of the conversation. That if there's going to be a displacement, or there's going to be a switch in energy, or an emotional labor in this interaction, then this is on me. So is that a fair?
Yeah, as the comforter,
yes,
that's on you. Yeah, and it's just the idea. So a lot of times, what I've realized in just living, and I've been taught this by people, is when I say, "Oh, don't cry," what I'm really saying is, I need you to make me feel more comfortable. Or if I say, "Hey, I perceive that you're upset about this," well, God works everything for the good. See, now that's a true statement, but it's not applied in love. It's applied by saying, I need this to be cleaned up for me.
And you get down to the heart of it. That's abuse, right? If you're going to somebody in that sort of way, to build yourself up, to satisfy your curiosity, or to satisfy your need to be a leader, or to satisfy your need to be the savior, that's spiritual and emotional abuse in somebody's most vulnerable moment.
I think so. And here's the important: if you as a listener say, "Oh, abuse," that's really strong. That's how people that receive it describe it. So if we are truly, and so one way we said, you're to be Jesus in that moment. You know what I mean? So there's no way we can be fully Jesus in that sense of knowing everything.
I've got the hair for it.
Well, there you go. So maybe I'll send you first. But it's the idea of being, when I say you be Jesus, you be the strongest listener to God and the most loving force in that room. So if they say, "Hey, I don't need anything," you respect them and you move away. If they say, "No, I'm fine," and you notice somebody just spilled something, you're like, "Hey, may I clean that up?" Mm-hmm. And they say, "I don't care," you clean it up. They say, "I'd love you to," you clean it up. They say, "Don't do it," don't do it. This kind of thing, a person that's grieving feels out of control. Okay, I had an experience. So this is the day of the funeral. And it's Labor Day of 1996, and we come home, and Heather is still dressed in a dress that she bought specifically for the funeral, and she is taking out the trash. Everybody else is dressed in casual clothes, and they say, "We'll take out the trash. You're dressed nice," and she's like, "No, I'll take out the trash." And so everybody's looking at me, and she starts walking out to take out the trash. So I kind of jog after her. And I say, "Honey, I'll do that. I can do this." And she goes, "I'm taking out the trash." And all of a sudden we're arguing about it. What's happening there? She's in a world of no control, and she's found something she can control, and I'm taking that away from her. I'm the non-Jesus factor there. But I would veil it in, but I'm here serving. Mm-hmm. No, I'm here trying to make myself feel comfortable. And what I should have done is just so she ruins the dress. Who cares?
Yeah.
But this is the dynamic. When grieving happens and we don't know what to say, we try to clean it up, and cleaning up somebody else's mess is not your job.
And there's a sense in us, right? Grieving death, like, it creates a mess, and we're not comfortable with there being a mess.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And so now here's the thing. So for a believer, you're there to be a safe space. So I will say in funerals, if you're here angry today, God accepts that. Let me make sure we're clear on that. God chooses to allow psalms, individual psalms, to be included in his Bible that say, "Where the heck are you, God? Why are you so unjust? I can't wait for people to have bad things happen to them." That's pure anger, maybe even rage. And he chooses to leave it in his Bible. He could easily have cleaned that stuff up, easily. Mm-hmm. We have all kinds of examples of his people doing it wrong. I mean, I always go to David where he's murdering Moabites who have already surrendered to him. I'm just like, why would you include that in the Bible? Now understand, I'm not saying rage is, good. It's not admirable. What I am saying is God works with the wholeness of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so as somebody moving into Christ, we have to be moving in as Christ to another person. We have to be not just the truth element, which is important, but we have to be huge on the grace element. And you say, well, wait a minute. Are you saying truth is at a cost? Do you see Jesus? He could have corrected his apostles at every single turn, and he rarely does.
And people come up to him and they get things wrong, and Jesus never chases after them to tell them, "Oh, you need to get." It could be their only interaction that they have with Jesus, and Jesus does not feel the need to chase them down to correct them.
That's exactly right, and that's a message we've gotten in church. If somebody says or does something wrong, you better clear it up, or you're being unfaithful. Well, then by that measure, Jesus was way unfaithful. So when we think about working with Christians, and I'm going to segue now to working with people that aren't in Christ or aren't believers, I think what we want to think of first of all is hold hope for people. Hold the hope in your own heart that this will get better.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they're going off the rails, when they say, I'm just an atheist now, that's not the time to say, wait a minute, there's plenty of historical evidence about, there being a God, and look at nature. And no, You're there just like Jesus. People said really wrong things around Jesus, and he just watched them, and he waited for them. There's a time for correction.
Mm-hmm.
But in the intensity of grieving, that's not it.
So when Jesus, he comes along and he gives hope. This whole thing is about giving hope to the disciples in the midst of their grief, that there is something good coming from this. And when you're talking to a non-believer, there's no angel that came down while Jesus was in the grave to tell the disciples, well, you needed a hope. Remember when Jesus said this, you need a hope. And so I love what you said there of you carrying that hope, you being the one as a follower of Jesus to recognize that there is hope in this situation, that not all is said and done.
That's right. Now, I want to be clear on timing. So those first days after Jessica died, those first months, maybe even, that was a space to do that. Now, had we persisted in doing things, or if you take harmful behaviors or you take on addictions, things like this, now you're dealing with a different thing. It's still connected to the grieving, but you have a different thing here. So this evolves as time goes. But again, it's still the same basic thing. And this needs to be mentioned. I don't care if you call yourself a Christian or not, if you're a deist that said God gave us the Bible and then he left us on our own, this does not apply to you, I'm sorry. But if you are truly a Christ follower that believes that we have a living God who works through us always, then me saying, God, I'm here on behalf of you, I want to do the most loving thing, and I'm listening for you, God will give you what to do. God will provide it. I've experienced it way too many times. I've gone into too many funerals, including just one last week, where I felt the pressure, and I'm like, how will I know what to say? And God gave it to me. And he gave it to me months before, weeks before, days before, and in the moment, because we walk, or at least have the opportunity to walk with a living God. And so this is not just simply about knowing your Bible and okay, this situation comes up, apply A here. If this is not a work with God, you're on your own. And so I need to be clear in my statements. So how will I know when they go off the rails what to do? Well, you walk with the same God that will give you what to know, or help you to know what to do. And I think that's really, really important with when you're walking through this with people.
Mm-hmm. Act with the hope that you do have.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And trust that he'll give you what you need. I cannot tell you how many times I've gone into situations I didn't know what to do. I stayed quiet. At the end of the conversation with me just listening, they said, man, this helped me a lot. Mm-hmm. And then vice versa. I've gone into situations and they talk for 1 minute and I can tell they're not going to say anything else, and God gives me thing after thing to say to them, and they're like, man, this helped me a lot. So which is the right way? The right way is to trust that you walk with the living God whose Spirit knows what to do. And that's what the Bible teaches again and again, but many denominations have distanced themselves from that teaching because we've bought into this. We follow these rules, and so that's what dominates our life.
So to wrap up kind of a section of what you said, I think a lot of times when people approach somebody who's not a believer that is in grief, there's this need or this mindset, like, I have to make them a believer. Like, my job in this situation is to save them, to help them realize who Jesus is and basically to save them. And so if I were to kind of sum up a little bit what you're saying, the mindset needs to, like, yes, we're doing everything for them, But the mindset is not how do I make them a Christian or how do I make them a follower? It's how do I be a true follower? How do I be a true Christian in the fullest sense of the word? Is that a fair summation, or not summation of everything you said, but a fair kind of tack on?
Absolutely. Well, and so Paul will write, in 1 Timothy 2 that Jesus wants all men to be saved and come to knowledge of truth. He wants that. And I was about to say, but and when you watch Jesus, he doesn't seem compelled to make anybody a Christian. I mean, in the way that we would think, you know what I mean? He lets the rich young ruler walk away. He saves this man who was dominated by this demon called Legion. And he says, go do your thing. Tell what you know. And I'm like, Legion, or this man, he knows nothing. He knows he had demons inside him, and you came and healed him. That's all he knows. And Jesus like, that's all he needs. Yeah. And see, with a woman caught in adultery, I'm like, get her a 12-step. Come on, man. I mean, something to help her. And yet Jesus is like, I trust a living God. Mm-hmm. I do what I do, and I let them take the rest. That compulsion that you better help this person be saved, or you're the only Bible that they may ever read, I'm just saying that's anti-Jesus.
If Jesus can trust the disciples with the church, then we can trust God in this next moment.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So when I'm talking to a non-believer, it's similar in the sense God, number one, this person is not foreign to God because they don't believe in God. God knows this person better than they know themselves. God loves this person. But now, when you say it, like, well, of course he does. But I think a lot of times when we're talking to people that this person doesn't believe, we start to think, oh, I've got to really introduce God well. And we put all this pressure on ourselves and like, God already knows this person. You know what I mean? You're not creating the line. You might be participating in what God is doing. When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, we seed and we water. And then Jesus uses multiple examples. The chief of one is the parable of the sower, where he's just throwing the seed. But we wouldn't do it that way. We would come behind the sower and be like, what are you doing? Yeah, we would scoot that seed off the bad path and only do the fertile path. And we'd sit hovering over the plants that we thought were going to grow, and we'd try to weed it out, Mm-hmm. And God's like, do you not think I know what I'm doing?
Yeah.
I will say this. If I don't believe in God and somebody comes and is willing to put in the time with me, and I know they're a believer, and I curse God out, and I rail against the world, and I say I'm thinking about ending my life, and I'm really moody, for months, and that person stays in the game with me, and they still love me, that makes God so much more appealing than them saying, hey, I've got a Bible verse for you.
Yeah.
Now, I want to be clear. If you're walking with a living God, and that living God, his Spirit gives you a Bible verse, say that Bible verse. But this compulsion to, I got to make this work, that's at the fundamental heart of what's wrong with church today, is because God never says, I've given you some truth, go make it work. He said, I'm giving you a co-mission. I'm doing a mission. Will you walk with me on this?
So if we can both kind of wrap this up into a bow, I think at the heart of what Jason said and the heart of what Jesus is after is there's a reason that God has given you the relationships that he's given you. And there's a reason that you feel that we all feel the grief that we all feel the pain and the injustice that we feel towards death. And ultimately what we're trying to do, whether it's Jason and I, whether it's us talking to people who are in grief or it's ourselves, is we want to see the light of God. We want to see life. And when we say life, we mean life. We mean the fullest sense of that word. And we both, Jason and I, know from the everyday failure of ours to orchestrate our life, to make our life, the exact way that we want it to be, how we keep messing up with it, that the only way to get to that place, or the only way to get to life in the fullest sense, is trusting in God. And if our goal in working with people who are grieving, or in ourselves with grieving, is to get them, not to get them, but help them along their path to life in the fullest sense of the word, then it only happens when it's through the Holy Spirit and when we're just trusting God in the part that he has to play for us.
And one thing I want to make sure is clear. If Jesus was patient with the apostles, and they screwed it up and screwed it up and screwed it up, and he still said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, which means he can do whatever he wants. I want you and me to go into all the world and let people know about all this life. If he's going to be patient with them, he's going to be patient with you. He is patient with you. Mm-hmm. So if you've been listening and you're like, oh man, I've said that to people, I've done this, I've screwed it up, that's fine. Welcome to what it was like to be an apostle.
Yeah.
Welcome to being a follower of God. It's never about our accomplishment. It's about what will we do with this moment? Will we choose to trust him with this moment? And as always, there are things that I've said, you're like, well, what about this? And if we were talking individually, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's something else totally. And so do not devalue your walk with God. Let this conversation add to it, challenge it, oppose it, whatever would be stimulating to think about God with this. But what God has given you is valid too. And so I would encourage you, take all this in, keep talking to your living God, and allow him to lead you into these places that would be scary. But because he's there, you can have confidence that there will be life and that there will be hope.
So we're trying a new thing here. We want to honor people who reach out to us and talk about their experience with the podcast, and so we're gonna attempt to share some of the things that people have told us, have asked us questions about at the end of an episode when that happens. And so I want to read a letter that we received, that my wife and I received a week or so ago, and it's from Riley in Pittsburgh. It says this: me and my family listen to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast, and we really like listening to it. It was really interesting to hear that other people have doubts and aren't always 100% sure about God all of the time. I always feel like it was really horrible and awful to have any doubts, which was really stressful for me. It helped me a lot to hear that other people go through those doubts. I'm really sorry you lost your jobs for talking about those doubts. I'm sure that it happened for a reason, and I know God has a great plan for you both, even though it seems bad right now. I'm praying for you, and I hope things get better. From Riley, 14 years old, in Pittsburgh. Riley, you are an amazing young woman of God, and we thank you. Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. You can reach us at amazedandperplexed@gmail.com, or you can learn more about us at amazedandperplexed.com.